British Empire versus Indian rebels. 1857 AD Sepoy War, the empire that burned from within. You clicked for the story of a superpower set ablaze by its own soldiers. That story begins with shackles clinking in a parade ground. North India inhales the heat of May. Dust hangs in the air like held breath. 85 Indian sepoys stand in irons for refusing the new rifle cartridges, the ones rumored to be greased with cow and pig fat. A hush travels through the ranks, not obedience, something older. An English officer records a line that chills the page. The fire will not come from outside. Lanterns sway. A drummer hesitates. Somewhere beyond the barracks wall, a temple bell answers a church bell. Metal speaking to metal. A horse snorts. A match is struck. It fails. Another tries. What begins in this moment will topple cantonments, swallow treasuries, and drag princes, farmers, widows, and clerks into a whirlpool of loyalty and rage. Delhi will hear a throne creak again. Kanpur will stain the river. Villages will trade whispers faster than riders can gallop. Promises will snap like bowstrings. Mercy will thin. Maps will lie. One question remains on that silent ground, pressed between heartbeat and command. When the shackles fall, by keep, by file, or by fury, who decides what India becomes, and what an empire is willing to do to stop it? Ashes and Meerut. The sun dropped slow over Meerut, painting the parade ground in copper light. The air was still, the kind of stillness that listens. 85 Indian soldiers stood before their British officers, wrists bound in iron. They had refused the new Enfield cartridges, rumored to be greased with the fat of cows and pigs. A small object that carried the weight of God's dot in the silence. Boots crunched against gravel. The soldiers were sentenced to years of hard labor. No one spoke, but behind the silence, something moved in. Old wound breathing, again. The Indian ranks watched their brothers dragged away, shackled under the empire's gaze. Eyes met across the courtyard, some glistening with rage, others with disbelief. That night, the air was electric. Lanterns swung in the barracks corridors. Whispers filled the spaces where orders once did. A soldier named Mangal Pandey's name returned, like a ghost his hanging weeks earlier had been meant to scare obedience into their bones. Instead, it had planted something else. Rumor traveled faster than reason. The cartridges were only the spark. The powder was humiliation, unpaid dues, broken promises, and the slow erasure of pride. Each sepoy carried a story: the land seized from his village, the priest arrested, the tongue silenced in his own country. The empire had taken everything except belief, and that belief now twisted into resolve. Past midnight, drums echoed faintly from a nearby temple. Some said it was coincidence. Others swore it was a signal. Horses snorted in their stalls. A wind rose, sharp and dry. Then came the sound of a musket crack in the darkness. A single shot, impossible to tell whose, but it was enough. Flames leaped from the British officers' quarters before dawn. Soldiers who had once stood in neat British rows now stormed their own barracks. Iron gates bent beneath their fury. The rebels tore down flags that had hung over them for decades, and the sky burned with the reflection of something bigger than rebellion. It was memory, vengeance, and hope bleeding into one. By morning, Meerut was chaos. Families fled through alleys, clutching children and faith alike. The roads filled with smoke and shouts. British officers tried to rally, but confusion swallowed command. Some Indians, still loyal to the company, hesitated, caught between fear and fraternity. But hesitation had no place in the firestorm. In the city's heart, a group of rebels gathered around an old map, one that pointed toward Delhi. The thought passed like a spark from man to man. Delhi, where the Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar still breathed within faded palace walls. His name had become a whisper of legitimacy. The last ember of an empire India still remembered as its own. The rebels moved like a tide. Horses thundered down the Grand Trunk Road. Banners torn from British regiments now carried upside down, a symbol of reversal. Villages watched them pass, half in fear, half in awakening. Old men whispered that destiny had opened its eyes. Young men followed with swords and belief. Behind them, Meerut smoldered. The empire had always believed its power lay in control, in uniform lines and predictable obedience. But that morning revealed a truth the British had never feared enough to imagine. Control could burn too. Delhi loomed ahead. Its walls ancient, its throne empty of power, but heavy with meaning. Inside the Red Fort, Bahadur Shah Zafar spent his mornings writing poetry to a city that barely remembered he was emperor. When the rebels reached its gates, the palace guards trembled, unsure whether to defend or welcome them. They did neither. The rebels entered shouting his name not as a plea, but as a declaration. Bahadur Shah, frail and astonished, stepped into the courtyard. His eyes met theirs, filled with a century's weight of submission and forgotten pride. In that instant, an old empire was resurrected not in marble, but in faith. The British in Delhi were unprepared. They had believed the fire in Meerut was an isolated madness. But as messages arrived, outposts abandoned, telegraph lines cut, they began to sense something they hadn't felt before: vulnerability. From the rooftops, Delhi's citizens watched smoke rise from the cantonment beyond the city walls. In marketplaces, the sound of gunfire mingled with the calls of merchants pretending normalcy. Every household whispered its own prophecy. Some prayed for freedom, others for safety. None knew which side history would spare. For a brief, trembling moment, it seemed as if India itself had inhaled. Then came the roar. Rebel sepoys stormed through the gates, and the first shots inside Delhi shattered the illusion of control forever. The empire's officers scrambled toward the Red Fort, hoping the old emperor would protect them. But Zafar, pressed by his own people, made a choice that would seal both his fate and the rebellion's. He lent his name to the uprising. The British banner was torn down. The Mughal seal, once dismissed as reliquous, pressed onto new proclamations calling Indians to rise. For the first time in a century, Delhi spoke in its own voice. Yet beneath the triumph, unease simmered. The rebels were soldiers, not statesmen. Their unity was aflame, bright but fragile. Across India, British forces regrouped, sharpening their resolve in silence. Reinforcements marched from the hills, gunboats readied along the rivers. Retaliation was not a question, it was a certainty sharpening its blade. As Delhi rejoiced, Mangal Pandey's name returned again. Now myth, now martyr. Songs carried his defiance from mouth to mouth. But even among victory songs, a shadow crept. The empire had fallen back before. It always returned, ruthless, methodical, patient. Night cloaked the city, but it did not bring rest. In the emperor's chamber, Bahadur Shah sat alone by a flickering lamp. The rebels outside chanted his name as a god. He whispered poetry about ashes and empires, knowing gods are often made to be destroyed. From the ridge beyond the Yamuna, a distant flicker answered the city's firesteeny lights, moving, organized. The British columns had begun their march. Inside the Red Fort, celebration blurred into argument. Who would lead? Who would supply? Who would command? The unity that had risen in anger began to fracture under the weight of its own dream. The emperor closed his eyes. Somewhere beyond the palace walls, a child cried, and the sound carried through the corridors like prophecy. The fire that began in Meerut had reached its first hunger. But the empire had not yet spoken, and when it did, the world would learn how far it would go to reclaim what burned. The river wind shifted east, carrying smoke toward the British camps. Tomorrow, Delhi would no longer sleep. The peacock throne breathes. The first light of dawn slid over Delhi's domes, gilding smoke with gold. From the ridge, the British flag hung limp, unaware of the storm gathering beneath it. Inside the old Red Fort, Bahadur Shah Zafar sat by his window, staring at the Yamuna River turning silver. He had not been emperor for years only, a poet of fading empires. But that morning, fate came pounding at his gates. The doors burst open. Rebel sepoys, breathless and blood-streaked from Meerut's fires, rushed into the marble hall. Their eyes burned with something between faith and fury. Padshah, they called him. The word hung heavy, awakening ghosts in the pillars. Zafar turned slowly. The world, he thought, dead had returned, demanding his crown. Outside, crowds swelled like rising tide. Drums rolled, conch shells blared, and the cry spread through every street. Delhi was free. The old Mughal seal was stamped again. Orders went out in the emperor's name. It was the first rebellion that sounded like resurrection, but behind the jubilation, unease coiled. The city had woken too fast. Barracks filled with new recruitsmen who had never seen war, men whose rage was louder than their discipline. Merchants closed their shops, uncertain which flag would stand tomorrow. And the emperor, draped in royal silk that no longer fit his age, watched it all unfold with a poet's dread. Beauty, born beside ruin. The rebels begged for his command. Zafar's hands trembled as he signed their proclamations. His mind drifted to his own verses, lines about love, loss, and the silence of power. Yet, when his pen touched paper, he felt the air shift. For a moment, he was emperor again. By evening, Delhi streets gleamed with torches. Men swore oaths before gods and comrades. Priests, scholars, farmers all joined in a single breath of defiance. British officers trapped within the city sent desperate messages to their garrisons beyond the walls. None would reach. Telegraph wires had been cut. Horses ran until their lungs gave out. In the palace courtyard, a sepoy captain named Bacht Khan stood before the emperor. His voice carried the weight of command, his uniform scorched from battle. He promised to lead the fight, to protect Delhi, to build an army that could hold the empire itself at bay. Zafar looked at him and saw something both dangerous and divine. Man, the rebellion needed more than a poet. Yet loyalty is a storm that shifts its direction without warning. Even as Delhi celebrated, greed crept in. Rebel factions quarreled over plunder, over titles, over whose god had blessed their victory first. The emperor's court filled with arguments disguised as counsel. Unity began to flicker. From the British camp miles away, a different kind of silence, stretched a silence of precision. Officers marked their maps, calculating vengeance. Their letters spoke of retribution, but their hearts burned for something darker. Reinforcements from Punjab, from England, from the sea itself, were already on the march. In Delhi, word of approaching British forces spread like a rumor of death. Bacht Khan tried to fortify the city, drilling men who had never aimed a rifle. The emperor wrote poetry by candlelight. his verses caught between prayer and prophecy. "How strange," he murmured one night, "that freedom should sound so much like footsteps behind us." The first cannonball struck the city's outer wall at dawn. The noise split the air, and birds scattered over the river like torn pages. Panic rippled through the streets. Markets vanished into smoke. Mothers dragged children into cellars that would not save them. For days, the siege thundered. Rebel guns answered with fury but lacked precision. Each explosion carried both triumph and terror. In the palace, the emperor listened as walls shook. Ministers urged him to flee. He refused. "If my people die here," he said softly, "I die with them." But defiance has a cost. Food ran low, water fouled. The Yamina, once holy, turned dark with ash. Disease crept through the wounded. The rebels fought on, but their lines faltered under the empire's discipline. Every volley brought them closer to despair. One evening, the rebels captured a British messenger. In his satchel lay maps not of the city, but of its escape routes. Someone inside the Red Fort had betrayed them. The revelation spread through the ranks like poison. Fingers pointed. Trust cracked. Bakht Khan executed 3 men before sunset, but the fear did not fade. That night, the emperor dreamt of his ancestors, of Akbar, of Shah Jahan, of the throne that once ruled the world. They stood in silence, watching him kneel before them. When he awoke, he found his crown on the floor. Days later, the British broke through the Kashmiri Gate, street by street, house by house. Delhi turned into a graveyard of courage. The rebels fought from rooftops, from mosques, from burning ruins. Women carried water through bullets. Old men reloaded rifles with trembling hands. In the chaos, the emperor's sons tried to flee toward the river, believing escape still possible. They were captured at Humayun's tomb. The British officer who took them, Major William Hodson, did not hesitate. By dusk, their bodies lay in the open road, and the empire sent its message, written in blood. Inside the Red Fort, Bahadur Shah Zafar heard the news. He did not speak. The rebellion was dying. His sons were gone. He walked to the window and watched the smoke rise. The city that had once crowned him now whispered of surrender. But even as defeat spread through Delhi's veins, something unbreakable moved beneath it. The idea that India could rise, that men could choose their masters, had escaped the walls. No cannon could silence that thought now. When the British entered the Red Fort, they found the emperor seated on his throne, frail, unmoving. His poetry lay scattered across the floor. He looked at his captors with a calm that cut deeper than rage. "You have won the city," he said quietly, "but not the dream." They took him away at dawn, past the same river that once reflected his empire. Delhi fell silent behind him, not in peace, but in exhaustion. And somewhere beyond the hills, fires still flickered. Lucknow, Kanpur, Jhansi. The rebellion had lost its crown, but not its fire. The empire thought the heart of the storm had been crushed. It was wrong, because every dying ember carries within it the memory of flame. Rivers run with Osa's smoke drifted over the Ganges like ghostly silk. In its reflection, the empire's shadow trembled, not broken yet, but bleeding. Delhi had fallen, yet the rebellion had not died. It had scattered, multiplying like sparks across a dry plain. Each spark found its own wind. In Kanpur, the air was thick with dust and disbelief. General Wheeler's British garrison held the entrenchment, surrounded by rebels who had sworn loyalty to Nana Sahibwins, a friend of the company, now its enemy. His face bore no joy, only resolve carved deep by betrayal. The British had denied him his father's pension. Now he sought repayment, not in gold, but in justice, or what men call justice when pain had been long ignored. The siege began with a silence that pressed on the lungs. Days passed under the sun's relentless glare. Cannon fire punctuated prayers. Wells ran dry. Mothers dipped rags into muddy puddles for their children. The rebels fired from temple towers. The British replied from crumbling ramparts. Between them lay a no-man's land of broken wagons and bodies too dangerous to retrieve. Inside the entrenchment, fear began to whisper in the accents of hunger. Women sewed bandages from torn uniforms. Men chewed leather to silence their stomachs. Every dawn brought a new round of surrender offers, and every dusk, refusal. They believed reinforcements would come. They always had before. But this time, the horizon remained empty. Nana Sahib sent word. If they laid down their arms, their lives would be spared. Exhausted, they agreed. On a June morning, carriages were prepared to take them to safety. The rebels opened the gates. The survivors stepped out, sunburned, hollow-eyed, trusting the promise of mercy. Then came the sound. One rifle fired too soon, or perhaps exactly when it was meant to. The carriages halted. A shout rippled through the crowd. Within moments, the air filled with gunfire and screams. Chaos devoured order. Men fell first, then women, then the silence after, heavier than death itself. The Bibigur well filled that day with what words could never cleanse. And though history would argue forever who gave the order, what mattered was what followed. The river carried the story downstream, each retelling darker than the last. When it reached British ears, it no longer spoke of war. It spoke of vengeance. Lucknow heard the echoes next. The residency there became both fortress and tomb. Sir Henry Lawrence led the defense, but fever took him before the walls did. The siege stretched for months, and every night the sky flashed with distant lightning and musket fire so close that even prayers learned the sound of gunpowder. Inside, they rationed water by the drop. Outside, rebels dug trenches, closing the circle. Both sides buried their dead before dawn to hide the number. And still, the empire's pride refused to surrender. When relief finally arrived, columns marching through smoke and ruin, it was not victory they found. Only survival draped in ash. Word of Kanpur's massacre spread through the British ranks like fire through dry leaves. Officers spoke less of law and more of revenge. Villages, suspected of sheltering rebels, were razed. Prisoners were tied to cannons, their bodies torn apart in thunder meant to echo justice. The cycle fed on itself, each act of cruelty justifying the next. The empire's red became darker than its flag. Yet in the chaos, new names began to rise, voices of resistance that refused to fade. In Jhansi, a widow sharpened her defiance into destiny. Rani Lakshmibai, draped in armor, rode with her adopted son tied to her back, her sword gleaming under a sun that showed no mercy to conqueror or rebel alike. She had been denied her kingdom by law. Now she reclaimed it by fire. The British called her the Jezebel of India. Her people called her Ma. Both names carried fear. She trained men and women alike, teaching courage through the language of survival. Her palace became a forge, her cause a storm. When the British columns finally reached her gates, they did not find rebellion, they found conviction wearing the face of a queen. Jhansi fell, but not easily. The Rani rode out through cannon smoke, sword high, her horse leaping over the walls as if refusing gravity itself. Witnesses swore they saw her cut through a dozen men before the dust swallowed her. When her body was found days later, even the enemy bowed before it. The empire had won a battle, but lost something greater, its illusion of unquestioned dominion. Everywhere, the pattern repeated. Cities fell, others rose. The rebels had no single banner now, only shared rage. The British had discipline, but it was cracking beneath the weight of fear. It was not a war anymore. It was a reckoning, written in the blood of both ruler and ruled. And yet, even as India burned, both sides believed they were the ones saving it. In Calcutta, British officers drafted new decrees to punish treason, blind to how those words only deepened defiance. In the countryside, peasants who had never seen a uniform took up arms. Thinking freedom meant land. Thinking land meant dignity. The rivers ran with oaths. Each crossing, each bridge, each burned ferry carried messages written in rumor. Delhi fallen. Lucknow holds. The Queen fights still. The rebellion had become a current that even defeat could not dam. But deep within the storm, one truth remained unspoken. The empire's strength was returning. Reinforcements poured in from across the seas, ships heavy with men who had never seen India, but who had already been taught to hate it. Their orders were clear. No leniency, no hesitation. No survivors where rebellion had lived. The rebels were scattered, their leaders hunted, their hopes hanging by threads of smoke. But in the hearts of the people, something irreversible had awakened. It was not just anger anymore, it was awareness. Night fell on the ruined banks of the Ganges. A group of surviving sepoys huddled around a dying fire. They spoke not of victory, but of promise. Even if we die, one whispered, they will never forget that we stood. His words were not meant for the wind, yet the wind carried them. Across the plains, the empire was rebuilding its march. Bayonets gleamed under a rising moon. The next dawn would bring a tide too strong to resist. But somewhere in that darkness, unseen, a spark refused to die. And as the river moved, silent and endless, the question followed it downstream: when all the guns fall silent, whose story will the world remember? Teeth of the empire. The wind that carried the smell of gunpowder from Lucknow to Calcutta no longer spoke of rebellion. It spoke of judgment. The empire had begun its return, not with words, but with silence so deliberate it felt rehearsed. Ships docked at Bombay, Calcutta. Regiment after regiment poured ashore, polished, pale, and patient. They came not as soldiers reclaiming order, but as executioners performing a ritual. The British called it pacification. India called it something else. Villages that had never seen a rifle woke to the sound of marching boots. Columns of red and khaki crossed fields, still blackened from last year's fires. They passed temples and mosques stripped of offerings, fields littered with bones whitened by the sun. Every stop brought into every silence, punishment. The empire moved like an old predator that had rediscovered its hunger. In Kanpur, the well was sealed with stone. In Delhi, the dead still lay uncounted. But vengeance demanded new blood. Orders arrived from London cloaked in civility, yet every line dripped intent. No rebellion must breathe again. Punishment must teach the land to forget. At dawn, prisoners were tied to cannons. Crowds were forced to watch. When the guns fired, the sound became memory, one the empire hoped would echo for generations. British officers took photographs beside the ruins, their journals describing it as justice served with efficiency. But among their own ranks, even some began to avert their eyes. For vengeance has a way of eroding the hands that wield it. In Lucknow, relief columns finally broke the siege but found only devastation. The residency stood like a cracked monument to futility. Walls riddled with holes, windows shattered, courtyards piled with the bodies of defenders and attackers alike. British flags were raised again, but there was no triumph in their flutter, only exhaustion. Among the ranks walked young officers who would write home of honor restored. Yet in the quiet between battles, many could not sleep. The Empire's victory had begun to smell like decay. In Jhansi's shadow, a British patrol discovered the charred body of a Queen Lakshmibai, the Rani, who had refused to kneel. Her armor had melted into her skin, her sword still clutched in her hand. The commander ordered her burned with honors, though his men didn't understand why. Because, he said, some enemies make you remember what courage looks like. But courage was no defense against empire. One by one, the rebel strongholds fell. Gwalior Bareilly era. Every surrender, written with blood instead of ink. The rebellion's fire flickered, then dimmed, leaving behind only the smoke of what could have been. Yet beneath that smoke, something stirred the question that refused to die. Had India truly been defeated, or merely silenced? In London, parliamentarians argued over what to call the catastrophe. Some blamed the East India Company's greed, others the natives' superstition. None spoke of arrogance. The company was dissolved, its authority transferred directly to the British Crown. Queen Victoria's name replaced the company's seal. The pretense of commerce gave way to the nakedness of empire. A proclamation arrived soon after, promising mercy, equal justice, and respect for faith. The ink had barely dried when the soldiers it addressed were still burning villages to the ground. Words of compassion cannot travel faster than cannon fire. And yet, India listened. Because even in lies, people search for cracks of truth. Some saw in that proclamation a chance of promise to survive long enough to change the meaning of loyalty. Others saw only chains gilded in rhetoric. In Delhi, Bahadur Shah Zafar sat in exile. His poetry now smuggled across borders like contraband hope. His words traveled further than his empire ever had. The blood of the martyrs is not forgotten. It writes the dawn in crimson ink. The British believed his verses harmless. They were wrong. Poetry moves slower than bullets, but it never misses. Back in the plains, the monsoon returned, washing the ash from the streets, but not the memory. Farmers planted in silence. Soldiers patrolled in silence. Widows mourned in silence. India had become a nation of listeners. Each ear turned toward the next rumor, the next chance, the next breath of revolt. And yet, beneath the calm, something new was taking root. The empire had won, but in its victory, it had taught India its own secret, the power of unity. Before 1857, rebellion had been regional. After 1857, memory itself became the map. Years later, British officers would write that the uprising was over by the autumn of 1858, but the truth lay in the eyes of the survivors. Every orphan who had watched a father hanged, every soldier who had buried his comrade without a name, every village elder who had seen gods desecrated and still lit the evening lamp. The empire's cannons could silence both, but not belonging. As Queen Victoria's proclamation reached India, read aloud in towns by trembling interpreters, crowds gathered. The official voice promised peace, protection, and forgiveness to all who submitted. For a moment, people wanted to believe. But as the words faded into the wind, one man in the crowd whispered what many thought but dared not say: "They forgive us today so that we may forget tomorrow." The crowd did not answer. They simply bowed their heads, not in acceptance, but in calculation. Because submission, they had learned, could also be a disguise. The British called their victory absolute, but the rivers still whispered names. The empire feared to remember Meerut, Kanpur, Lucknow, Jhansi, each one a scar that refused to fade, and though guns now lay silent, every silence carried a pulse. The rebellion was dead. The idea was not. The empire's banners flew higher than ever, but the air beneath them felt heavier, thicker with secrets, with guilt, with the slow gathering of another kind of storm. In the darkness of a rebuilt Delhi, a child knelt by the river and dropped a rusted bullet into the current. He watched it sink, the ripples spreading outward, soft and endless. His mother called him inside. He turned once more toward the water, his eyes steady. The river moved on, carrying that small, forgotten piece of metal downstream toward the sea, toward the world beyond the horizon. And somewhere, far across that horizon, the empire slept, unaware that the tide it had unleashed was already coming home. Embers that refused to die. The empire had won, or so it told itself. Across India, the Union Jack rose again over fort and courthouse, over riverbank and ruin. But beneath it, the air carried a different sound, quiet, steady, patient. Not the roar of rebellion, but the breathing of a wounded land that refused to sleep. The Red Fort was empty now. Its marble corridors, once heavy with command, echoed with the footsteps of guards who spoke in a foreign tongue. Bahadur Shah Zafar the last Mughal sat thousands of miles away in Rangoon, exiled from the soil that had birthed his ancestors. His poetry still reached India on scraps of smuggled paper, inked in grief and pride. "Do not say I am gone," one verse whispered. "I am the dust that remembers the footstep." The British read those lines and smiled. They saw weakness, but the people read them and felt their own names hidden between the words. From the ashes of the mutiny, the empire rebuilt itself with precision. Railways stretched across the plains like veins of iron, carrying both goods and obedience. Telegraph poles pierced the sky, binding distant provinces to London's command in seconds. Laws were rewritten, taxes refined, schools established to shape new minds in English syllables. To the British, this was progress. To the Indians, it was a cage made of glass, transparent, invisible, and inescapable. Yet beneath that glass, memory kept growing, like roots through stone. In marketplaces, songs returned. In village firesides, old men retold the stories of 1857, not as defeat, but as inheritance. They spoke of Mangal Pandey as if he were still alive, of Lakshmibai as if her horse still thundered through the night. Every retelling changed something small until legend became truer than fact. The empire noticed. Its governors issued edicts to erase dangerous myths. But myths are never erased. They wait. By the late 1860s, a new kind of unrest began to hum across India. Quieter, cleverer, educated Indians, trained in the language of their rulers, began to use that very language to question rule itself. In Calcutta's coffee houses, men debated the meaning of liberty. In Bombay, merchants gathered to speak of representation. In Allahabad, a young lawyer named Motilal Nehru began studying the British Constitution not to obey it, but to understand where it might be broken. The empire didn't notice at first. It believed rebellion had to carry guns. But this new rebellion carried ink. It traveled by newspaper, by pamphlet, by whisper in classrooms where teachers told students that knowledge was another kind of sword. Still, the land bore its scars. Villages taxed beyond survival emptied into cities. Famines spread like smoke. In one monsoon alone, 1 million lives vanished between rain and neglect. The government wrote reports. The people dug graves. Yet the will to endure remained, quiet as a prayer that never ends. In those years, British officers began to notice something unsettling in the eyes of their subjects. Not hatred, not fear, something calmer. A kind of watching. It was as if India had learned how to wait. And waiting, as the empire would learn, is its own weapon. By the 1870s, Queen Victoria declared herself Empress of India. The jewel in her crown, now burnished with blood. Delhi celebrated with fireworks. The same city that had once burned beneath rebellion. The British called it the Delhi Durbar, a festival of loyalty. But among the crowds, some faces did not cheer. They looked past the spectacle, past the drums and flags, and saw something else. The empires need to be adored. Because only a power that fears memory builds its monuments so high. In the quiet that followed, India began to speak again, but in new tongues. Poets disguised revolution as prayer. Painters hid protest in their colors. Philosophers wove dissent into scripture. Freedom had changed. Shape. It was no longer a sword but a seed, planted in minds that no empire could fully command. The British built schools to make Indians more English. Instead, they made Indians more aware. The very education meant to pacify would one day ignite again. But for now, the land waited. Every generation learned not just to obey, but to remember. Years later, when a young boy in Porbandar would sit by a window, reading of justice and empire, the echoes of 1857 would still hum in his ears. When a clerk in Calcutta would write of home rule, the shadow of the Rani would move behind his pen. When students marched decades later, they would not call it vengeance, they would call it continuation. The empire never realized that its greatest victory was also its undoing. It had unified India under its flag, but in doing so, had taught every corner of that vast land to recognize itself as one. And so the story did not end where the cannons fell silent. It simply changed rhythm. The empire that burned from within had not extinguished itself. It had smoldered into something far more dangerous, an idea that would outlive every uniform, every law, every throne. By the end of the century, British officials began to speak in private of a strange unease. The natives are restless again, they wrote, but this restlessness had no faces, no forts, no armies. It moved through language, through art, through the silence of millions who no longer bowed in their hearts. The fire that began in Meerut had changed form, becoming invisible, patient, waiting to rise again in another century, under another name. One evening, as dusk settled over the Ganges, an old soldier sat by the river, his hair white, his hands trembling. He had fought in 1857 and lived to see his grandchildren grow under the same empire he had tried to end. He looked at the water and smiled faintly. "We lost," he murmured, "but they will finish it." The current caught his words and carried them downstream, toward the sea, toward history. The ripples shimmered in the dying light, each one a memory, refusing to fade. And as the night fell, across the subcontinent, in cities and villages, in silence and song, a question rose once more. When an empire builds itself upon ashes, how long before the wind remembers what to do?